Chapter 18. Selena smiled as she watched the Crown Prince of Adalin lead the Princess of Eloy through the basic steps of fencing. He was charming, she supposed, in an arrogant sort of way, but someone with his title could have been far, far worse. It made her uneasy how he had made her blush. In fact, he was so attractive that she had difficulty not thinking about how attractive he was, and again wondering why he wasn't married. She sort of wanted to kiss him. She swallowed. She'd been kissed before, of course, by Sam, and often enough that she was no stranger to it. But it had been over a year since she lost the assassin she'd grown up with, and even though the thought of kissing anyone else had made her sick, when she saw Dorian. Princess Nehemia lunged, slapping Dorian on the wrist with the sword. Selena bit down her laughter. He grimaced and rubbed the sore joint, but then smiled as the princess began gloating. Damn him for being so handsome. She leaned against the wall and would have enjoyed the lesson had not someone not grabbed her hard enough to hurt. What is this? Dragging from the wall, she found herself facing Cole. What is what? What is Dorian doing with her? She shrugged. Sparring? And why are they sparring? Because he volunteered to teach her how to fight. Cole practically shoved her from him as he approached the pair. They stopped, and Dorian followed Cole to a corner. They spoke, quickly, angrily, before Cole came back to Selena. The guards will take you to your chambers. What? She remembered their conversation on the balcony and frowned. So much for swapping stories. The test is tomorrow, and I need to train. I think you've had enough training for today. It's almost dinner. Your lesson with Brullo ended 2 hours ago. Get some rest or you'll be useless tomorrow. And no, I don't know what the test will be, so don't bother asking. That's absurd, she cried, and a pinch from Cole kept her voice down. Princess Nehemia cast a worrying glance in Selena's direction, but the assassin waved at her to resume a lesson with the Crown Prince. I'm not going to do anything, you insufferable moron. Are you honestly so blind you can't see why we can't allow this? Can't allow? You're just afraid of me. Don't flatter yourself. You think I want to go back to Endeavor? She hissed. You think I'm not aware of the fact that if I flee, I'll be hunted down for the rest of my life? You think I don't know why I vomit when you and I run in the morning? My body is a wreck. I need to spend these extra hours here, and you shouldn't punish me for that. I'm not going to pretend to know how a criminal's mind works. She threw her hands in the air. You know, I actually feel guilty. Just a little guilty. And I remember why I shouldn't have. I hate sitting around locked in my rooms, bored out of my senses. I hate all those guards and nonsense. I hate you telling me to hold back when Brullo sings Cain's praises. And I'm just there, boring and unnoticed, in the middle. I hate being told what I can't do, and I hate you most of all. He tapped his foot on the ground. Are you finished? There was no kindness in Cole's face, and she clicked her tongue as she left, her fists aching to bash his teeth down his throat. Chapter 19. Sitting in a chair near the hearth of the great hall, Caitlin watched Duke Parrington converse with Queen Georgina atop her dais. It had been a shame that Dorian had left so quickly an hour ago. She hadn't even had the chance to speak to him, which was especially irksome, given that she had spent the better part of the morning dressing for court. Her raven black hair was neatly coiled around her head, and her skin glowed golden from the subtle, shimmering powders she dusted on her face. Though the bindings on a pink and yellow gown crushed her ribs, the pearls and diamonds around her neck strangled her, she kept her chin high, poised. Dorian had left, but having Parrington show up was an unexpected surprise. The Duke rarely visited court. This had to be important. Caitlin rose from a chair by the fire as the Duke bowed to the Queen and strode towards the door. As she stepped into his path, he paused at the sight of her, his eyes gleaming with the hunger that made her want to cringe. He bowed low. My lady. Your Grace, she smiled, forcing all that repulsion down deep, deep, deep. I hope you're well, he said, offering his arm to lead her out of the hall. She smiled again, taking it. Though he was somewhat rotund, hard muscle lay in the arm beneath the hand. Very well, thank you. And yourself? I feel I haven't seen you in days and days. What a wonderful surprise to have you visit the court. Parrington gave her a yellow smile. I've missed you too as well, my lady. She tried not to wince as his hairy, meaty fingers rubbed her pristine skin, and instead delicately inclined her head towards him. I hope Her Majesty was in good health. Was your conversation a pleasant one? Oh, it was so dangerous to pry, especially when she was here in his good graces. Meeting him last spring had been a stroke of luck, and convincing him to invite her to court, mostly by implying what might await him once she was out of her father's household, and without a chaperone, hadn't been that difficult. But she wasn't here to simply enjoy the pleasures of the court. No, she was tired of being a minor lady waiting to be married off to the highest bidder, tired of petty politics and easily manipulated fools. Her Majesty is quite well, actually, Parrington said, leading Caitlin towards her rooms. Her stomach clenched a bit. Though he didn't hide that he wanted her, he hadn't pushed her into bed. Yet. But with a man like Parrington, who always got what he wanted, she didn't have much time to find a way to avoid owning up to the subtle promise she'd made him earlier that year. But, the Duke went on, with a son of marriageable age, she's busy. Caitlin kept her face plain, calm, serene. Can we expect any news of an engagement in the near future? Another dangerous question. I certainly hope so, the Duke grumbled, his dark face darkening. Beneath his ruddy hair, the jagged scar along his cheek stood out starkly. Her Majesty already has a list of girls deemed appropriate. The Duke halted, remembering whom he spoke to, and Caitlin batted her eyelashes at him. Oh, I'm quite sorry, she purred. I didn't mean to pry into the royal household's affairs. She patted his arm, her heart kicking into full gallop. Dorian had been given a list of appropriate brides. Who was on it? And how could she... No, she'd think of that later. For now, she had to find out who stood between her and the crown. It's nothing to apologize for, he said, his dark eyes shining. Come, tell me what you've been doing these past few days. Not much of note, though I met a very interesting young woman, she said casually, leading him down a window-lined stairwell into the glass section of the castle. A friend of Dorian's, the Lady Lillian, he called her. The Duke went positively rigid. You met her? Oh, yes. She's quite kind. The lie rolled off her tongue. When I spoke to her yet today, she mentioned how much the Crown Prince likes her. I hope for her sake she was on the Queen's list. While she wanted some information about Lillian, she wasn't expecting this. The Lady Lillian? Of course she isn't. The poor thing. I suspect her heart will be broken. And it's not my place to pry, she went on, the Duke growing redder and more furious by the moment. But I heard it not an hour ago from Dorian himself that... That what? A thrill went through her at his anger. Not anger at her, but at Lillian. At the weapon she just had the good fortune to stumble across. He's very attached to her, possibly in love with her. That's absurd. It's true. She gave a morose shake of the head. How tragic. Foolish is what it is. The Duke stopped at the end of the hallway that led to Caitlin's room. His anger loosened his tongue. Foolish and daft and impossible. Impossible? Someday I will explain. A clock chimed off kilter, and Parrington turned in its direction. I have a council meeting. He leaned close enough to whisper in her ear, his breath hot and damp against her skin. Perhaps I'll see you tonight. He dragged a hand down her side before he walked away. She watched him go, and when he disappeared, she let out a shuddering sigh. But if he could get her close to Dorian... She had to find out who her competition was. But first she had to find a way to get Lillian's claws out of the prince. List or no list, she was a threat. And if the Duke hated her as much as it seemed, she might have powerful allies when the time came to make sure Lillian released her hold on Dorian. Dorian and Cole didn't say much as they walked to dinner in the great hall. Princess Nehemia was safely in her chambers, surrounded by her guards. It had been quickly agreed that while it was foolish of Selena to spar with the princess, Cole's absence was inexcusable, even with the dead champion to investigate. You seem rather friendly with Sardathine, Cole said, his voice cold. Jealous, are we? Dorian teased. I'm more concerned for your safety. She might be pretty and might impress you with her cleverness, but she's still an assassin, Dorian. You sound like my father. It's common sense. Stay away from her, champion or no. Don't give me orders. I'm only doing it for your safety. Why would she kill me? I think she likes being pampered. If she hasn't attempted to escape or kill anyone, then why would she do it now? He patted his friend on the shoulder. You worry too much. It's my occupation to do so. Then you'll have grey hair before you're 25, and Sardathane certainly will not fall in love with you. What nonsense are you talking about? Well, if she does try to escape, which she won't, then she'll break your heart. You'll be forced to throw her into the dungeons, hunt her down, or kill her. Dorian, I don't like her. Sensing his friend's growing irritation, Dorian changed the subject. What about the dead champion? The Eye Eater? Any idea who did it, or why? Cole's eyes darkened. I've studied it again and again over the past few days. The body was totally destroyed. The color leached from Cole's cheeks. Innards scooped out and gone. Even the brain was missing. I've sent a message to your father about it, but I'll continue investigating in the meantime. I bet it was just a drunken brawl, Dorian said, though he'd been in plenty of brawls himself and had never known anyone to go about removing someone's innards. A trickle of fear formed in the back of Dorian's mind. My father would probably be glad to have the Eye Eater dead and gone. I hope so. Dorian grinned and put an arm around the captain's shoulders. With you looking into it, I'm sure it'll be solved tomorrow, he said, leading his friend into the dining hall. Chapter 20. Selena closed the book and sighed. What a terrible ending. She stood from the chair, unsure where she was going, and walked out of the bedroom. She'd been willing to apologize to Cole when he found her sparring with Nehemia that afternoon, but his behavior. She paced through her rooms. He had more important things to do than guard the world's most famous criminal, didn't he? She didn't enjoy being cruel, but hadn't he deserved it? She'd really made a fool out of herself by mentioning the vomiting, and she'd called him all sorts of nasty things. Did he trust her or hate her? Selena looked at her hands and realized she'd wrung them so badly that her fingers were red. How had she gone from the most feared prisoner in Endeavour to this sappy mess? She had greater matters to worry about, like the test tomorrow, and this dead champion. She'd already altered the hinges on all her doors so they squeaked loudly any time they opened. If someone entered her room, she'd know well in advance, and she'd managed to embed some stolen sewing needles into a bar of soap for a makeshift miniature pike. It was better than nothing, especially if this murderer had a taste for champion blood. She forced her hands to her sides, shaking her unease, and strode into the music and gaming room. She could not play billiards or cards by herself, but Selena eyed the pianoforte. She used to play. Oh, she'd love to play. Loved music. The way music could break and heal and make everything seem possible and heroic. Carefully, as if approaching a sleeping person, Selena walked to the large instrument. She pulled out the wooden bench, wincing at the loud scraping sound it made. Folding back the heavy lid, she pushed her feet on the pedals, testing them. She eyed the smooth ivory keys and the black keys, which were like gaps between teeth. She'd been good once, perhaps better than good. Arabin Hamel had made her play for him whenever they saw each other. She wondered if Arabin knew she was out of the mines. Would he try to free her if he did? She still didn't dare to face the possibility of who might have betrayed her. Things had been such a haze when she'd been captured. In 2 weeks, she'd lost Sam and her own freedom and lost something of herself in those blurry days too. Sam. What would he make of all this? If he'd been alive when she was captured, would he have made her out of the royal dungeons before the king even got word of her imprisonment? But Sam, like her, had been betrayed, and sometimes the absence of him hit her so hard that she forgot how to breathe. She touched a lower note. It was deep and throbbing, full of sorrow and anger. Gingerly, with one hand, she tapped out a simple, slow melody on the higher keys. Echoes, shreds of memories arising out of the void of her mind. Her rooms were so silent that the music seemed obtrusive. She moved her right hand, playing upon the flats and sharps. It was a piece that she used to play again and again until Arabin would yell at her to play something else. She played a chord, then another, added in a few silver notes from her right hand, pushed once on a pedal, and was gone. The notes burst from her fingers, staggering at first, but then more confidently, as the emotion in the music took over. It was a mournful piece, but it made her into something new and clean. She was surprised that her hands had not forgotten, that somehow in her mind, after a year of darkness and slavery, music was still alive and breathing. That somewhere between the notes was Sam. She forgot about time as she drifted between pieces, voicing the unspeakable opening old wounds, playing and playing as the sound forgave and saved her. Leaning against the doorway, Dorian stood, utterly transfixed. She'd been playing for some time with her back to him. He wondered when she'd notice him or if she'd ever stop at all. He wouldn't mind listening forever. He had come here with the intention of embarrassing a snide assassin, and had instead found a young woman pouring her secrets into a pianoforte. Dorian peeled himself from the wall. For all her assassinating experience, she didn't notice him until he sat down on the bench beside her. You play Her fingers slipped on the keys, which let out a loud, awful clank, and she was halfway to the rack of cue sticks when she beheld him. He could have sworn her eyes were damp. What are you doing here? She glanced at the door. Was she planning on using one of those cue sticks against him? Cole isn't with me, he said with a quick smile. If that's what you're wondering, I apologize if I interrupted. He wondered at her discomfort as she turned red. It seemed far too human an emotion for a Darlin's assassin. Perhaps his earlier plan to embarrass her wasn't foiled yet. But you're playing so beautifully that It's fine. She walked towards one of the chairs. He stood blocking her path. She was of surprisingly average height. He'd glanced down at her form. Average height aside, her curves were enticing. What are you doing here? She repeated. He smiled roguishly. We decided to meet tonight. Don't you remember? I thought it was a joke. I'm Crown Prince of Adalin. He sank into a chair before the fire. I never joke. Are you allowed to be in here? Allowed? Again? I am a prince. I can do what I like. Yes, but I am Adalin's assassin. He wouldn't be intimidated, even if she could grab that billiards cue, and skewer him within a matter of seconds. From your playing, it seems that you're a great deal more than that. What do you mean? Well, he said, trying not to get lost in her strange, lovely eyes. I don't think anyone who plays like that can be just a criminal. It seems you do have a soul, he teased. Of course I have a soul. Everyone has a soul. She was still red. He'd made her that uncomfortable. He fought his grin. This was too much fun. How do you like the books? They were very nice, she said quietly. They were wonderful, actually. I'm glad. Their eyes met, and she retreated behind the back of the chair. If he didn't know any better, he would have thought himself to be the assassin. How's training going? Any competitors giving you trouble? Excellently, she said, but the corners of her mouth drifted downward. And no, after today, I don't think any of us would be giving anyone any trouble. It took him a moment to realize she was thinking of the competitor who'd been killed while trying to escape. She chewed on her bottom lip, quiet for a heartbeat, before she asked, Did Cole give the order to kill Sven? No, he said. My father commanded all the guards to shoot to kill if any of you tried to escape. I don't think Cole would have ever given that order, he added, though he wasn't sure why. But the unnerving stillness in her eyes abated. At least, when she didn't say any more, Dorian asked as casually as he could. On that note, how are you and Cole getting along? Of course, it was a totally innocent question. She shrugged, but he tried not to read too far into the gesture. Fine. I think he hates me a bit, but given his position, I'm not surprised. Why do you think he hates you? For some reason, he couldn't bring himself to deny it. Because I'm an assassin, and he's captain of the guard, forced to belittle himself by minding the would-be king's champion. Do you wish it were otherwise? He gave her a lazy grin. That question wasn't so innocent. She inched around the chair, coming closer to him, and his heart jumped a beat. Well, who wants to be hated? Though I'd rather be hated than invisible. But it makes no difference. She wasn't convincing. You're lonely? He said it before he could stop himself. Lonely? She shook her head, and finally, after all that coaxing, sat down. He fought against the urge to reach across the space between them to see if her hair was as silky as it looked. No, I can survive well enough on my own, if given proper reading material. He looked at the fire, trying not to think about where she'd been only weeks before, and what kind of loneliness might have felt like. There were no books in Endeavour. Still, it can't be pleasant to be one's own companion at all times. And what would you do? She laughed. I'd rather not be seen as one of your lovers. And what's wrong with that? I'm already notorious as an assassin. I don't particularly feel like being notorious for sharing your bed. He choked, but she went on. Would you like me to explain why? Or is it enough for me to say that I don't take jewels and trinkets as payment for my affection? He snarled. I'm not going to debate morality with an assassin. You kill people for money, you know. Her eyes became hard and she pointed to the door. You may leave. Now. You're dismissing me? He didn't know whether to laugh or yell. Shall I summon Cole to see what he thinks? She crossed her arms, knowing she had won. Perhaps she'd also realize that there was fun to be had in riling him too. Why should I be thrown from your rooms for stating the truth? You just called me little more than a whoremonger. You hadn't had this much fun in ages. Tell me about your life. How you learned to play the pianoforte so masterfully. And what was that piece? It was so sad. Were you thinking about a secret lover? He winked. I practiced. She stood walking towards the door. And yes, she snapped, I was. You're quite pricky tonight, he said, trailing her. He stopped a foot away, but the space between them felt strangely intimate, especially as he purred. You're not nearly as chatty as you were this afternoon. I'm not some odd commodity that you can gawk at. She stepped closer. I'm not some carnival exhibit, and you won't use me as part of your unfulfilled desire for adventure and excitement, which is undoubtedly why you chose me to be your champion. His mouth fell open and he conceded a step. What? Was all he managed. She stalked past him and dropped into the armchair. At least, she wasn't leaving. Did you honestly think I wouldn't realize why you came here tonight? As someone who gave me the crown of a hero to read, which suggested a rather fanciful mind that yearns for adventure? I don't think you're an adventurer, he muttered. Oh? The castle offers so much excitement that the presence of Adalin's assassin is nothing unusual. Nothing that would entice a young prince who's been confined to a court all his life. And what does this competition suggest? For that matter, I'm already at your father's disposal. I won't become his son's jester, too. It was his turn to blush. Had he ever been scolded by anyone like this? His parents and tutors, perhaps, but certainly not a young woman. Don't you know who you're talking to? My dear prince, she drawled, examining her nails. You're alone in my rooms. The hallway door is very far away. I can say whatever I wish. He burst out laughing. She sat up and watched him, her head tilted to the side. Her cheeks were flushed, making her blue eyes even brighter. Did she know what he might have wanted to do with her if she wasn't an assassin? I'll go, he said at last, stopping himself from wondering if he could actually risk it. Risk his father's and Cole's wrath. And what might happen if he decided to damn the consequences? But I'll return. Soon. I'm sure, she said dryly. Good night, Sardathine. He looked around the rooms and grinned. Tell me something before I leave. This mysterious lover of yours. He doesn't live in the castle, does he? He instantly knew he'd said the wrong thing when some of the light vanished from her eyes. Good night, she said a bit coldly. Dorian shook his head. I didn't mean to. She just waved him off, looking towards the fire. Understanding his dismissal, he drove stone to the door, each of his footsteps sounding in the now too silent room. He was almost at the threshold when she spoke, her voice distant. His name was Sam. She was still staring at the fire. Was Sam. What happened? She looked at him, smiling sadly. He died. When? He got out. He wouldn't never have teased her like that. Never said a damn word if he'd known. Her words were strangled when she said, 13 months ago. A glimmer of pain flashed across her face, so real and endless that he felt it in his gut. I'm sorry, he breathed. She shrugged, as if it could somehow diminish the grief he still saw in her eyes, shining so bright in the firelight. So am I, she whispered, and faced the fire again. Sensing she was truly done talking this time, Dorian cleared his throat. Good luck at the test tomorrow. She didn't say anything as he left the room. He couldn't banish her heart, wrenching music from his mind, even when he burned his mother's list of eligible maidens, even when he read a book long into the night, even when he finally fell asleep. Chapter 21. Selena dangled from the stone wall of the castle, her legs trembling as she dug her tar-covered fingers and toes into the cracks between the giant blocks. Brullo shouted something at the other 19 champions remaining, scaling the castle walls, but from 70 feet up, the wind carried his words away. One of the champions hadn't shown up for the test, and even his guards hadn't known where he went. Maybe he actually managed to escape. Risking it seemed better than this miserably stupid test anyway. She gritted her teeth, inclining her hand upwards and pulling herself up another foot. 20 feet up and about 30 feet away, flapping the object of this insane race, a golden flag. The test was simple. Climb the castle to where the flag was waved 90 feet above in the air, and retrieve it. First one who grabbed the flag and brought it back down received a pat on the back. Last one to reach the designated spot would be sent back to whatever gutter they came from. Surprisingly, no one had fallen yet, perhaps because the path to the flag was fairly easy. Balconies, windowsills, and trellises covered most of the space. Selena scooted up another few feet, her fingers aching. Looking down was always a bad idea, even if Arabin had forced her to stand on the ledge of his Assassin's Keep for hours on end to become accustomed to heights. She panted as she grasped another window ledge and hoisted herself up. It was deep enough that she could crouch within, and she took a moment to study the other competitors. Sure enough, Kane was in the lead, and had taken the easiest path towards the flag, Grave and Varen on his trail, Nox close behind, and Pella the young assassin not far below him. There were so many competitors following him that their gear often got tangled together. They'd each been given the opportunity to select one object to aid them in their ascent. Rope, spikes, special boots. And sure enough, Kane had gone right for the rope. She had taken a small tin of tar, and as Selena rose from a crouch on the windowsill, her sticky black hands and bare feet easily gripped the stone wall. She'd used some rope to strap the tin to her belt, and before she stepped out of the shade of the sill, she rubbed a little more on her palms. Someone gasped below, and she swallowed the urge to glance down. She knew she'd taken a more difficult path, but it was better than fighting off all the competitors taking the easy route. She wouldn't put it past Grave or Varen to shove her off the wall. Her hands suctioned into the stone, and Selena heaved herself upwards just in time to hear a shriek, a thump, and then silence, followed by the shouting of onlookers. A competitor had fallen and died. She looked down and beheld the body of Ned Clement, the murderer who called himself the Scythe, and spent years in the labor camps of Calicula for his crimes. A shudder went through her. Though the murder of the Eye Eater had made many of the champions quiet down, the sponsors certainly didn't seem to care that this test might very well kill a few more of them. She shimmied up a drain pipe, her thighs clinging to the iron. Kane hooked his long rope around a leering gargoyle's neck, swung across an expansive flat wall, landing on a balcony ledge 15 feet below the flag. She fought her frustration as she worked her way up higher and higher, following the course of the drain pipe. The other competitors shuffled along, following Kane's path. There were a few more shouts, and she looked down long enough to see that Grave was causing a backup, because he couldn't manage to toss his rope around the gargoyle's neck as Kane had. Varen nudged the assassin aside and moved past him, easily securing his own rope. Nox, now behind Grave, made to do the same, but Grave started cursing at him, and Nox stopped, lifting his hands in a gesture of placation. Smirking, Selena braced her blackened feet on the stabilizing bracket, holding the pipe in place. She'd soon be directly parallel to the flag, and then only 30 feet of bare stone would separate her from it. Selena eased further up the pipe, her toes sticking to the metal. 15 feet below her pipe, a mercenary was clutching the horns of a gargoyle as he set about fastening his rope around its head. He seemed to be taking the faster route across a cluster of gargoyles. Then he'd have to swing along onto a landing 18 feet away before making his way to the other gargoyles on which Grave and Nox now quarreled. She was in no danger of him trying to scale the drainpipe to bother her. So inch by inch she moved up, the wind battering her hair this way and that. It was then that she'd heard Nox shout, and Selena looked in time to see Graves shove him from their perch atop the gargoyle's neck. Nox swung wide, the rope wrapped around his middle going taut as he collided with the castle wall below. Selena froze, her breath catching as Nox scraped his hands and feet against the stone to catch hold. But Grave wasn't done. He bent under the guise of adjusting his boot, and Selena saw a small dagger glint in the sunlight. How he'd gotten the weapon past his guards was a feat in itself. Selena's warning cry was carried away by the wind as Grave set about soaring Nox's rope from his tether on the gargoyle. None of the other champions nearby bothered to do anything, though Pella paused for a moment before easing around Grave. If Nox died, it was one less competitor, and if they interfered, it might cost them this test. Selena knew she should keep moving, but something kept her rooted to the spot. Nox couldn't find a hold on the stone wall, and without a nearby ledge or gargoyle to grasp, he had nowhere to go but down. Once the rope broke, he'd fall. One by one, the threads of his rope snapped beneath Graves' dagger, and Nox, sensing the vibrations, looked up at the assassin in horror. If he fell, there was no chance of surviving. A few more slices of Graves' rope and blade, and the rope would be severed entirely. The rope groaned. Selena moved. She slid down the drainpipe, the flesh of her feet and hands tearing open as the metal cut into her skin, but she didn't let herself think of the pain. The mercenary on the gargoyle below only had time to lean into the wall as she slammed in the creature's head, gripping its horns to steady herself. The mercenary had already tied one end of his climbing rope around the gargoyle's neck. Now she seized it and tied the other around her own waist. The rope was long enough and strong enough, and the 4 gargoyles perched beside her would provide enough space to run. "Touch this rope, and I'll gut you," she warned the mercenary, and readied herself. Nox shouted at Grave, and she dared to look where the thief dangled. There was a sharp snap of rope breaking, and Nox's cry of fear and rage, and Selena took off, sprinting across the backs of the 4 gargoyles before she launched herself into the void. Chapter 22. Wind tore at her, but Selena kept her focus on Nox, falling so fast, so far from her outstretched hands. People shouted below, and the light bouncing off the glass castle blinded her. But there he was, just a hand's breadth from her fingers, his grey eyes wide, his arms swinging as if he could turn them into wings. In a heartbeat, her arms were around his middle, and she slammed into him so hard that the breath was knocked from her chest. Together they plummeted like a stone, down, 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 towards the rising ground. Nox grabbed the rope, but even that wasn't enough to lighten the blinding impact on her torso as the rope went taut. She held on to him with every ounce of strength she had, willing her arms not to let him go. The rope sent them careening towards the wall. Selena hardly had the sense to lean her head away from the approaching stones, and the impact burst through her side and shoulder. She held tight to him still, focusing on her arms, on her too shallow breathing. They hung there, flat against the wall, panting as they looked at the ground 30 feet below. The rope held. "Lillian," Nox said, gasping for breath. He pressed his face onto her hair. "Gods above!" But cheers erupted from below and drowned out his words. Selena's limbs trembled so violently that she had to focus on gripping Nox, and her stomach turned over and over and over. But they were still in the middle of the test, still expected to complete it, and Selena looked up. All the champions had stopped to see her save the falling thief. All except one who perched high, high above them. Selena could only gape as the flag was ripped down, and Cain howled his triumph. More cheers rose up to meet them as Cain waved the flag for everyone to see. She seethed. She would have won if she'd taken the easy route. She would have gotten there in half the time it took Cain. But Cole had told her to stay in the middle anyway, and her path had been far more impressive and demonstrative of her skills. Cain just had to jump and swing. Amateur scaling. Besides, if she'd gone the easy way, she wouldn't have saved Nox. She clenched her jaw. Could she get back there in time? Perhaps Nox could take the rope, and she'd just scale the wall with her bare hands. There was nothing worse than second place. But even as she thought it, Varen, Grave, Peller, and Renault climbed the last few feet to the spot, tapping over the hand before descending. "Lillian, Nox, hurry up," Brullo called, and she peered down at the weapons master. Selena scowled and started sliding her feet along the cracks in the stone, looking for a foothold. her skin raw and bleeding in spots, stung as she found a crevice for her toes to squeeze into. Carefully, she pulled herself up. I'm sorry, Knox breathed, his legs knocking into hers as he sought out a foothold. It's fine, she told him. Shaking, numb, Selena climbed back up the wall, leaving Knox to figure out the way on his own. Foolish. It had been so foolish to save him. What had she been thinking? Cheer up, Cole said, drinking from his glass of water. 18th place is fine. At least Knox plays behind you. Selena said nothing, and pushed the carrots around on a plate. It had taken 2 baths and an entire bar of soap to get the tar off her aching hands and feet, and Philippa had spent 30 minutes cleaning out and binding the wounds on each. And though Selena had stopped shaking, she could still hear the shriek and thump of Ned Clement hitting the ground. They'd carried his body away before she finished the test. Only his death had saved Knox from elimination. Grave hadn't even been scolded. There'd been no rules against playing dirty. You're doing exactly like we planned, Cole went on, though I'd hardly consider your valiant rescue to be entirely discreet. She glared at him. Well, I still lost. While Dorian had congratulated her for saving Knox, and while the thief had hugged and thanked her again and again, only Cole would frown when the test was over. Apparently, daring rescues weren't part of a jewel thief's repertoire. Cole's brown eyes shone golden in the midday sun. Wasn't learning to lose gracefully part of your training? No, she said sourly. Arabin told me that 2nd place was just a nice title for the first loser. Arabin Hamel? Cole asked, setting down his glass. The king of the assassins? She looked towards the window, and the glittering expanse of Rifthorn barely visible beyond it. It was strange to think that Arabin was in the same city, that it was so close to her now. You know he was my master, don't you? I'd forgotten, Cole said. Arabin would have flogged her for saving Knox, jeopardizing her own safety and place in this competition. You ever saw your training personally? He trained me himself, and then brought in tutors from all over Aurelia, the fighting masters from the rice fields of the southern continent, poison experts from the Bogdano jungle. Once he sent me to the silent assassins in the Red Desert. No price was too high for him. Or me, she added, fingering the fine thread of her bathrobe. He didn't bother to tell me until I was 14 that I was expected to pay him back for all of it. He trained you, and then made you pay for it? She shrugged, but was unable to hide the flash of anger. Courtesans go through the same experience. They're taken in at a young age and are bound to their brothels until they can earn back every coin that went into the training, upkeep, and wardrobe. That's despicable, he spat, and she blinked at the anger in his voice. Anger that, for once, was not directed to her. Did you pay it back? A cold smile that didn't reach her eyes spread across her face. Oh, down to the last copper. And he went out and spent all of it. Over 500,000 gold coins, gone in 3 hours. Cole started from his seat. She shoved the memory down so deep that it stopped hurting. You still haven't apologized, she said, changing the subject before Cole could inquire further. Apologized? For what? For all the horrid things you said yesterday afternoon when I was sparring with Nehemia. He narrowed his eyes, taking the bait. I won't apologize for speaking the truth. The truth? You treated me like I'm a crazed criminal. And you said that you hated me more than anyone else alive? I meant every word of it. However, a smile began to tug at her lips, and she soon found it reflected on his face. He tossed a piece of bread at her, which she caught in one hand and threw it back at him. He caught it with ease. Idiot, she said, grinning now. Crazed criminal, he returned, grinning too. I really do hate you. At least I didn't come in 18th place, he said. Selena felt her nostrils flare, and it was all Cole could do to duck the apple she chucked at his head. It wasn't until later that Philippa brought the news. The champion who hadn't shown up for the test had been found dead in a servant's stairwell, brutally mauled and dismembered. The new murder cast a pall over the next 2 weeks, and the 2 tests they brought with them. Selena passed the tests, stealth and tracking without drawing much attention to herself or risking her neck to save anyone. No other champions were murdered, thankfully, but Selena still found herself looking over her shoulder constantly, even though Cole seemed to consider the two murders to be just unfortunate incidents. Every day she got better in running, going farther and faster, and managed to keep from killing Kane when he taunted her at training. The Crown Prince didn't bother to show his face in her rooms again, and she only saw him during the tests, when he usually just grinned and winked at her, and made her feel ridiculously tingly and warm. But she had more important things to worry about. There were only 9 weeks left until the final duel, and some of the others, including Nox, were doing well enough that those 4 spots were starting to look rather precious. Kane would definitely be there, but who would the other final 3 be? She'd always been so sure she'd make it. But if she was honest with herself, Selena wasn't so sure anymore.